It is dangerous to be right when the government is wrong.
The value of money. What is a storehold of wealth? That is a bond. In other words, one man's debt is another man's assets, bondholders. And so we're going to be in a situation where if that storehold of wealth is in jeopardy because there's too much supply and demand and so on, and we have a monetary inflation, we will have great disruptions. And that could be like the breakdown of the monetary system in 71. It could be like 2008. It's going to be very severe. I think it could be more severe than those if these other matters simultaneously occur.
As the trade wars heat up, we are seeing nation states decide to sell their U.S. denominated debt. This is causing yields to spike on the 10-year and 30-year. Recently, we saw Japan sell a ton of treasuries into the U.S. 10-year and 30-year, and we saw yields spike. This put a lot of pressure onto the markets.
The value of money, internal conflict, that is not the normal democracy as we know it, and international conflict in a way that is highly disruptive to the world economy and could even be a military conflict, just as these breakdowns have occurred before. You know, we have a new order that began in 1945, a new monetary order and a new geopolitical order. And these go in cycles that can be measured. And I worry about the breakdown of that kind of an order, particularly since it doesn't need to happen, because there are certain things that could be done in which this is better, a better restructuring of these debts and actions taken.
Ray Dalio is a billionaire investor, and he has come out with a theory that we are following the same cycle over and over again. We're seeing the rise and fall of great empires, and as an empire starts to decline, see another empire start to rise. And his theory is that China is the empire that's rising. In these patterns, he recognizes that technological advances happen, natural disasters start to happen, as well as turmoil within the dominant country starts to happen. And we're seeing all of these things come to fruition.
So the question specifically, what's holding back adoption of interbank payments on blockchain systems? I don't think anything's holding it back, to be honest. I think we tend to kind of underestimate in the short run, underestimate in the long run, and overestimate in the short run. I think we're on track for adoption at large. But I mean, let's think about how we do interbank payment systems today. There's real-time gross settlement systems. Real-time gross settlement systems are alive and active in most modern economies. They have a lifespan of about 20 to 30 years. So for most of the countries that implemented RTGS systems in the 90s and early 2000s, they're kind of coming up on that transformation, and they're building for the next 20 to 30 years. And we're likely to see a lot of these blockchain or tokenized or distributed systems incorporated in the next evolution of interbank payment systems. So I think we're on track, but I think there's still a lot of things that are complex when we think about these systems relative to the systems that exist today that are being figured out as we go. One of them, for example, is when we think of a system that's always on 24/7, even though that's great for adoption, what does that do to monetary policy transmission, for example? What does that do to how we calculate remuneration and interest rates, things like that? And when we start thinking about how these systems interconnect with each other, so in the context of cross-border payments, or how a system like this would support clearing and settlement for digital assets, I mean, there are details there that really need to be figured out because the behavior of these systems is, at its core, fundamentally different than a lot of the centralized systems that we have today. So I don't think that there's anything holding us back. I think we're completely on track, and I think in the long run that will be self-evident.
He works for the BIS Innovation Hub, and he says that we overestimate in the short term, but underestimate in the long term, and we're right on track for digital asset adoption. The U.S. has gained its dominance from having the reserve currency, and in return, having countries all over the world invest in U.S. markets. But that trend is starting to change, and these technologies are global by nature. They're going to open up markets for everybody to participate in without them being under the US jurisdiction. So simultaneously, you're having these trade wars put a lot of doubt in US markets while this technology is global and open and this path to adoption is accelerating.
I think that right now we are at a decision-making point and very close to a recession. And I'm worried about something worse than a recession if this isn't handled well. A recession is 2 negative quarters of GDP, and whether it goes slightly there, we always have those things. We have something that's much more profound. We have a breaking down of the monetary order. We are going to change the monetary order because we cannot spend the amounts of money, so we have that problem. And when we talk about the dollar and we talk about tariffs, we have that. We are having profound changes in our domestic order, how ruling is existing, and we're having profound changes in the world order. Such times are very much like the 1930s. I've studied history, and this repeats over and over again. So if you take tariffs, if you take debt, if you take the rising power challenging the existing power, if you take those factors and look at the factors, those changes in the orders, the systems, are very, very disruptive. How that's handled could produce something that is much worse than a recession.
Over and over again, we see the financial markets break down, and then the central banks have some type of response where they add debts and deficits to their balance sheet. For example, in 2008, the banks were insolvent, and the Fed had to step in order to bail out all of the banks and revive the economy. Now, this took some time, but eventually the economy started to move on its own, but the Fed never gave up its centrally planned role in controlling the economy. And this is why the debts and deficits keep increasing enormously, and the Fed's balance sheet has ballooned. The Federal Reserve relies on other countries to buy US denominated debt. And since the US dollar is the reserve currency, there's plenty of friends and foes willing to purchase US debt. Now, as trade wars escalate, this is a way for other countries to start unloading their US denominated debt, and that puts a tremendous amount of pressure on the financial markets, and the Fed needs to intervene. They're going to need to control the yields that come from the treasuries, and this will cause their balance sheet to balloon. You've probably heard or listened to Gregory Mannarino talk about the big one comes when the U.S. debt market collapses. And he's absolutely correct. And we're starting to see some symptoms of that.
Then you need to bridge the traditional world with the digital world. No digital islands. No experiments which are isolated somewhere on whatever technology. And we got that by building, a tokenization of existing assets and vice versa. So this all sounds easy, but this took years to achieve, and we did. So now we really get to implement, and we see a paradigm shift again, where banks are really voicing their desires and their expectations in terms of use cases that you mentioned. Proactively, because they recognize, okay, we did the groundwork, like building a house, you need to start digging the hole, that's been done long ago. So now we can get to talk about the things which everybody wants to actually talk about, but few have the preconditions for actually getting them done at the institutional level.
The banks have been working with blockchain technologies since the very beginning, and we are now starting to witness real-world assets, stocks, bonds, different types of financial assets in the traditional world be emulated and recreated in the tokenized world. And what's amazing about this is that we're watching the monetary order starting to collapse while a new system is being revealed to everybody. Yet few understand where this is headed and how fast it can evolve.
Blockchains. And I think the three biggest things that I would highlight, the first one would be digital assets. So the more digital assets are adopted, the more you would need a form of central bank money that is native in that world to do proper settlement, because central bank money is the safest settlement asset that exists. The next one I would say is tokenized deposits or stable coins or things that are derivatives of central bank money or private money that's issued on top of central bank money. So again, the closer coupled those two things can be, I would say the more value proposition there is in that ecosystem. And then cross-border payments is another pain point and another place where there's a lot of value to add by bringing these systems, these tools and these technologies into traditional finance.
These tokenized systems are going to be live 24/7, 365 days a year. You are seeing regulations pass that are favorable towards the crypto world. And banks are allowing this infrastructure to go live. You're seeing central banks approve this infrastructure. And at the same time, you're seeing the monetary order break down. You're seeing mass inflation. So what happens when people are holding currencies that are rapidly depreciating in an environment where markets are open 365 days a year, 24/7, and even AI algorithms controlling a lot of trades? Well, we're going to see an exodus out of currencies and into asset prices.
So instead of using Swift, and banks, when they have Swift, they have these funds they hold on behalf of one another called nostros and vostros, right? That wouldn't need to exist anymore. If XRP, for example, was used to bridge two fiat currencies on either side. So one bank issues the instruction to Ripple, Ripple swaps that fiat into XRP, swaps it to fiat on the other side, and boom, the transaction's done in a matter of milliseconds, and it costs like next to nothing. It's brilliant. What it requires, though, to be really, really successful is to have more participants on it. So last time I checked, it had around 300 financial institutions participating on RippleNet for their payments optimization, I guess. That compared to Swift is quite small. Swift has got many, many thousands of participating institutions. So once more adopters are on board, and adopters are not individual users here, they're businesses, they're financial institutions. When we see more of them on board, we'll see this thing grow at an exponential pace.
This is Candice Mesk from DevComp, which is a New Zealand integrator for banks. And what she says is very true about Ripple is that the last time she checked, there is only 350 plus banks and financial institutions using RippleNet, and the network becomes more and more valuable as more and more participants join. And we heard Brad Garlinghouse announce that after the SEC dropped the lawsuit, that the U.S. market started to pick up steam. As we see regulations pass and favorable news towards the crypto world, I believe that this number is going to move exponentially.
However, with this kind of a solution where there is a crypto asset that's somehow at work for this cross-border transaction to take place, there's different jurisdictions potentially where that crypto asset would... It's a tricky thing because it lives on the blockchain, which is really decentralized, but at different points in time, it's effectively part of some jurisdiction, and that jurisdiction may have certain regulatory requirements. So Ripple, I've seen recently, has gone to quite a bit of trouble to go and get the right licenses in various jurisdictions for this payment solution. So it's quite onerous, actually.
Yeah.
Now, the United States has been lagging with crypto regulations, and they are finally starting to regulate. Now, it is a bit more complex than just having the U.S. regulate. This certainly is a step in the right direction, but international laws, the international intergovernmental agencies like the FSB, the BIS, and others are going to have to write out clear guidelines.
Is that Swift is innovating at quite a rapid pace. They want to be here to stay. And in order to be relevant long into the future, they've got to compete. There is a Swift, what do they call it? I think it's a global payments initiative called it's Swift GPI. and they've already figured out how to settle transactions in like an hour, for example. So Swift is definitely, they're in the race. They're not giving up. How long they can stay in the race, I guess that will be determined. So my sense is that we'll still see Swift for quite a while.
Now remember, SWIFT is payment instructions. As central banks upgrade to real-time payments, as you see different settlement processes like CLSnet upgrade into different blockchain-based systems, we could see international cross-border payments accelerate with newer technologies behind a lot of the different jurisdictions. Now, where Ripple is different, right, is that they're native in the tokenized world already. So with Hidden Road that was just acquired, they're already 10 steps ahead of Swift. They're already creating on-ramps for tokenized securities, tokenized derivatives, everything. They're creating the infrastructure. While Swift is not the infrastructure providers, they try to partner with different jurisdictions that have the infrastructure, and they try to partner with different banks and create some type of an agreement between all banks on how to move assets. And the Web3 movement is about putting the assets in the owner's hands. It's about the infrastructure being available for everybody. So no longer will Swift be able to be the gatekeepers for very long, and it's only a matter of time before Swift is a thing of the past.
Related to too much debt. Debt is money. Second, internal order. How does our system work? Who's going to get control of this problem? And then number three, in addition of the five main forces, there's also throughout history climate. Acts of nature, droughts, floods, and pandemics have killed more people and toppled more orders. And then there's also throughout history, man's inventiveness and new technologies, which is creating this transformative result.
Right.
The interactions of these is what going on. So if we look at tariffs represent a dealing with the imbalances. The imbalance means we have a tremendous capital imbalance and a tremendous trade imbalance, which is unsustainable. And so that's the backdrop of this. Related to that is also the international conflict. How do you have dependency, mutual dependency? How can the United States be a safe country and not manufacture things and have to import them for China? Or how can China be safe in terms of having capital, an American capital? Those connections are breaking down.
The system is no longer fit for purpose, and we will see a contraction in globalization that will manifest back to nationalism and creating supply chains back in the United States as well as other countries, and the utilization of technology like automation, robotics, 3D printing, drone technology, the list goes on and on. These technologies will enable a brighter future for nationalism. You know, for a very long time, we were dependent on the slave labor of China. But now that we have these newer technologies, we are going to be able to produce things at home for less. Now, don't get me wrong, there will be a readjustment period, and this could be devastating on the markets as well as our debt load. And that's where blockchain technology comes in. You know, you're no longer going to be able to trust each nation's with intellectual property, with financial markets, with bonds, derivatives. Everything is going to need to have trust baked into it. So on the international level, we could still continue doing business without worrying that somebody will do something destructive in order to benefit themselves. A government that robs Peter to pay Paul can always depend on the support of Paul. Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the show. Please take a moment to like and subscribe. If you enjoy content like this, please consider joining my Patreon.